KT Media.
Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. On this podcast, we focus on the dynamics that infect our well-being in all of our relationships. Our relationship with ourself, which is often our most neglected relationship, but also with people, both our precious people and also difficult people, but even our relationship with God. It's surprising how the dynamics that infect our human relationships can also infect our relationship with God. On this show, we most commonly focus on reactivity and triggers, but today I want to talk about grief. You know, when we think about grief, we automatically connect grief and death, and that's true. In fact, as of the recording of this conversation, death is close to my heart right now. I have a dear friend who suddenly and unexpectedly lost a precious family member this week, way too young. The funeral's tomorrow, and I'll be going to grieve and support my friend. But grief isn't just related to death. It actually shows up in any loss or even massive and sudden change. Particularly those of us in North America are swirling in massive change right now, trying to orient ourselves and make sense of our place and our way forward. So I just want to pause and ask, what's your relationship with grief? Isaiah used the very understated phrase that Jesus was acquainted with grief. Acquainted. What a quiet word to describe Jesus' own relationship with this colossal force called grief. My own relationship with grief is typically one of avoidance. I am really uncomfortable sitting in grief. I prefer movement and activity and action over contemplation and thinking. I've always been an optimist, but sometimes my optimism comes out like anxiety in the face of grief. I'm militantly optimistic to keep the wave of grief at bay. I anxiously need to look on the bright side. And even in this part of my life, I'm learning to befriend grief and see the gift that it offers. Grief is so tightly attached to fear. I think that's why we struggle with it, because fear makes us feel isolated. We forget that God is with us when we are afraid. But John reminds us that perfect love casts out fear. I think grief is also disorienting and it makes us feel lost. But God is the great finder, isn't he? God loves to find us when we're lost, and God enters into our grief. And so we pause and light a candle to relax into God's presence and remember we're not alone. And even if we're feeling lost and disoriented, God is the great finder. God is with us in it all. Let's light the candle now. Today, I want to highlight an interview on grief because I found this conversation profoundly helpful in my own life. Some of my longtime listeners will remember this conversation with Steve Carter, who dealt with the process of grieving over much loss in his life in a really short period of time. Steve's an incredibly gifted Bible teacher and preacher. He's also the author of several books. And the book on grief that he wrote, called Grieve, Breathe, and Receive, started his journey of grief when he was going to be the teaching pastor of Willow Creek Church after Bill Hybels' planned retirement. Instead, in 2018, instead of Hybels retiring, his secret life came to the surface through some national newspaper investigations, and Steve found himself at odds with how the leadership board of Willow Creek were handling the accusations and the revelations about Hybels, and Steve chose to leave rather than step into the role that had been waiting for him. And for some people, particularly some congregants at that church, they went from absolutely adoring Steve to him becoming the focus of their anxiety. You might say that they couldn't dump their anxiety on the person who was causing it, Bill Hybels. He was gone, and so they dumped it instead on Steve. And in that season, he lost a lot that was precious to him, not just his vocation and calling, but also his home. And he also experienced the death of some very precious family members. So, in the same way that Isaiah uses the phrase, Steve Carter is well acquainted with grief. And I found this conversation with him profoundly helpful for me. So I wanted to share it again with my Being Human audience. I started the interview just by asking Steve about his 38th birthday, where this journey kind of began for him, what was going on and what was said to him. Here's my chat with Steve now.
Yeah, so every Wednesday, a couple of us would gather for a little breakfast. It was a time to just kind of share what was really going on in our life. And a buddy of mine had kind of been with a mentor of his, and he was saying and sharing a little bit about just the last few years have been really, really hard. And the mentor said, well, that's because you're kind of moving from the first half of life to second half of life. And those years between 38 and turning 43, those are really difficult years. I mean, your body changes. You're not as far as you thought you would be financially, professionally, your identity, your ego. You typically have a parent that dies. Those 5 years are some of the hardest years, if not the most difficult years of a man's life. And that coming weekend, I was turning 38. And that coming weekend, it was going to be announced that I was going to be one of the two successors at Willow Creek Community Church outside of Chicago and kind of succeed Bill Hybels. And I just remember like looking at my friend going, dude, I'm about to turn 38. Don't speak that voodoo over me, And a few nights after that, it was maybe the Friday or to the Saturday, I kind of woke up in a little bit of like anxious panic. And the only way I knew how to solve it was like, just do the math. 365 times 5, add 1 day for leap year. That's 1,826 days. Like, what could go bad in 1,826 days? And I will tell you, it was my dream job. It started out fantastic. And by the time I was 39, I had resigned from that role due to some allegations that had come out about my mentor, and just wanted to stand with the women and do what I thought was the best thing for the church, but also for my integrity. And so it just kind of led to a few years of trying to figure out, what do you do when life does what it does?
Yeah, I think about your friend that said that to you on your birthday. My first thought is, dude, you don't just know how to sing happy birthday to a guy? Like, that's first. For listeners and watchers that want to dig into the Willow story, I'll simply say, Steve, you were on my show a few years ago and we got right into it. I'm going to encourage people who want to. They can read your book. You, I think, actually very tastefully and respectfully get into what actually happened in the book. They can also listen to you on my podcast, others. I just say that to kind of move us through. Like if people are like, oh, I want to know. I'm not avoiding it. I'm just saying you and I have covered it. You've covered it in the book. You've covered it on other interviews in many places. Here's what I'm interested in for the sake of this conversation. Things are rolling out at Willow. You and Sarah are really struggling and trying to discern, what do we do? In these situations, people will say, oh, the will of God is doing the next right thing. How did you know to do what you ended up deciding to do, which was resign and step away?
Yeah, I think for me, there's something called the cadet's prayer. And my biological grandfather was like a multi-star general. He's actually buried at West Point. And I got really, really fascinated when I learned about the cadet's prayer. And it just became like a prayer I would regularly say, a journal about. But some of the lines were, may we be more committed to the harder right than the lesser wrong. May we live above the common level of life. I mean, this is from the early 1900s. Anybody who went to West Point had to memorize this full prayer. And I mean, the language of it is rich and deep. Never tell a half truth when the full truth can be one. Like, it's just like you put that on top of having a mentor who constantly asked me, when I was in high school and I was in junior high, did you have integrity today? He'd say to me, Steve, I don't care how many points you score. I don't care where you go to college. I don't care how much money you make. I don't care. All I care about is, did you mean what you say and say what you mean? And did you have integrity today? I often would write off when he said that to me when I was younger. But as I got older, I began to recognize, like, oh my goodness, this is what it's all about. You add then being a pastor, and then you become a father. One of the things I would ask my son, Emerson, who is now about to turn 16 from an early age, did you have an integrity today? When as he started to learn how to talk, 3, 4, he'd look back at me and go, Dad, did you have integrity today? And that's how we would end our night every night when I put him to bed. And so this question started to haunt me when I began to realize, oh, I think that we're choosing self-preservation as an organization rather than actually standing with the people who are actual victims. And the deeper issue underneath it was we're playing with people's trust. And I didn't sign up to be a pastor to play with people's trust. And so I think I just got to a point where I am now moving into a place of complicity if I pretend or I minimize or I don't use what I've been entrusted with to actually get to what the cadet's prayer would call the harder right. It's not what I'd wish on anyone. It was painful. I still feel like it's a bad dream that I'm going to wake up from someday. But I think at the end of the day, I hope that the messages that I preach, that I actually can embody them. And this just felt like one I needed to embody and not just talk about.
Yeah, it really came to a point where you were scheduled to preach and some more information had come out in the week, and you were asked or told to kind of preach as if nothing new has happened this week. And that became for you the pinch point. You were famously sickened backstage
Yeah.
trying to manage it. What I find fascinating is that kind of helped you clarify the next right thing and the integrity move. Were you surprised by the backlash? Like when you try to do the right thing, it's really hard to then receive backlash from people. You got quite a bit of backlash for that decision.
Yeah. Just one little context thing. Annie F. Downs was actually preaching, and I was doing an interview with Ira Glass from This American Life, who isn't a believer. So
Yeah.
Annie's doing a sermon. She taught on being brave. It was a fantastic message. I interview Ira Glass just about storytelling, his curiosity around faith, but not there yet. And it was amazing. And then these stories come out, and I'm like, hey, this is the New York Times who's saying this story. We call it a meeting. And I'm like, we got to talk about this. No, we can't talk about it. And all of a sudden, I just said, I got to use the restroom. And I threw up in Bill's back office bathroom. And I'm washing my face. And I look at the mirror and I think of how my mentor going, Steve, did you have integrity today? And I also think about my son looking at me and asking me tonight, did you have integrity today? And I thought to myself, if I go on that stage, I'm playing with people's trust. I'm not representing what I believe the truth of the gospel is to Ira Glass and to the victims. And this woman who's just told her story to the New York Times and was so vulnerable. And we're going to be like, it's not that big of a deal. I couldn't, man. And so I resigned through a blog post, and there's a whole reason why I did it that way. But honestly, man, I thought I was done. I was going to be the guy who didn't show up to church. No one's going to trust this guy. And I think what hit me, and it really, really surprised me, was people outside the Willow context were thankful that I actually did what I did. And people within the Willow context or that sphere felt like I abandoned and betrayed them. I thought it was going to be opposite. I thought the
Yeah.
outside world wouldn't know me, didn't understand why I did what I did, and they were going to shoot the shots. And the people who knew me were going to know what I did and try to get me back, if I'm really, really honest. And it didn't happen. And I think what happened was my exit made people realize there was more going on. I think that confronted some massive cognitive dissonance that I think for a lot of people weren't ready to explore.
Yeah. And you're also kind of describing the way a system works, I think, Steve. Like when you're in a system, it's so hard to see. When you're outside the system, it's so clear. I don't know if it's a frog in a boiler situation, but do you ever thought on what's going on there? Why is it so hard to see when you're caught up in it?
I mean, I think at that time, there was a lot of good. And I think sometimes you start doing the math and you start thinking, no, like it's 90% good or it's 80% good, like, and then I think sometimes the gravitational pull to an institution, to a leader can blind you. I also think that everyone has to count the costs. I never spoke to more people in a room than when I did. I never made as much money as I did. I never had like whatever influence would be. I'm a kid from Camarillo, California. I got plucked out of a small church in Fullerton, California to come be a teaching pastor at Willow Creek. I saw the next 25 years of my life. I loved my life, man. So I think all of a sudden you get put in this situation, your kids are settled, you're settled in a neighborhood, you're settled in a role, you're settled in a community. And I think sometimes it's just many of us just don't want to be unsettled for what we believe is right, or we don't want to see because of what it would cost. I understand that because I felt that for a couple months.
Resignation has financial implications. You're over the barrel for a book that you don't want to write. But the other thing, it wasn't just your financial future, your family's well-being. You start noticing as you stay in the neighborhood, you're taking your son out for coffee. Willow members are very comfortably coming up to you in front of your son and accosting you. Your name became a verb. So your reputation, now it's out of your hands. For someone with your kind of wiring, Steve, that's got to drive you absolutely crazy.
That's hard, man. That's hard. Yeah, people supposedly would say if someone got up and left a meeting, don't Carter me. And that was hard because you could almost fantasize who was the person who said it. Why would they say that? And you couldn't shut your brain down. I'm holding my son's hand at Starbucks and someone comes up and starts, you betrayed us. You're not a leader. You abandoned us. You're a coward. My son's looking at them and then looking at me. And I'll just never forget. He just said, Dad, you always told me if you do the right thing, you get rewarded. You either didn't do the right thing or you lied to me because that didn't feel like a reward. All of what I started to realize was there was a lot of shadows within me, ways that if people thought highly of me, I almost got a little juice from that. And then all of a sudden, you don't have that. You don't have it from teaching. You don't have it from leading. You don't have it from being on a team. And you don't really want to go outside. And then you look in the mirror and you don't even recognize yourself. It's just the weight of it. And then you feel frustrated because these innocent people don't know the whole story. It's all like within you, and not knowing how to process it was hard. It's really hard.
I find it fascinating when somebody, one of their highest values is then wielded against them. The first time I met you, Steve, I was actually with you and several of your friends, and we spent a week together in an international context.
We were on a bus for a long, I think like a 2.5 hour drive. And I'm like sitting by myself looking out a window, and you just sit down and you're like, can we talk about it? And I was like, who is this guy with the amazing accent? And I shared, 2 hours, I think, with you. And you were it was pastoral, therapeutic. Yeah. It was so kind. So sorry, I just wanted the context of you just initiating and being who you are was such a gift for me.
I read it somewhere that you were throwing up backstage. I remember praying for you in that moment and then thinking, if I ever meet this poor fellow, I would just like to be a source of relief in his life. So I walked away from our time together thinking to myself, I bet Steve Carter values loyalty to his friends and relationships as one of his highest values. Is that accurate to you?
Yeah. A 3 on the Enneagram in healthy integration goes to a 6, and loyalty it's really important to me.
Yeah. Therefore, being seen as disloyal where you cannot convince, like one more meeting is not going to convince them. That's painful. That's hard.
It's hard. It is. And then when you want to communicate or you want to write or you want to help and you can't, it led to a lot of soul searching for me of, okay, like, why do I need them to see me in this way? Why do
Yeah.
I need their approval? And you're not going to get it. And maybe in time you will, but right now, this can't be what you're focusing on.
You and Sarah move to the desert, literally and metaphorically. You take it as a spiritual pilgrimage. You're going to Arizona, it's around some of Sarah's family, and you're just trying to take stock. And, people might say, oh, Steve Carter, that's the former Willow guy. And that's what they know. But then you start to, in the book, you start to open up about your adoptive dad, your search for your birth father. What that strikes in me is the tendency for Christians to read these stories, like Willow was a world famous story, and forget that the people involved are human beings. I'd love to get your take on that. How can we do better? Some of these things have to be exposed, I believe. So I believe there are some people that their ministry, they really say, my ministry is bringing these things to the light and they're publishing things. I understand that. But I'm also seeing a disturbing trend of forgetting that the people involved are human beings. So like in your case, you're going through deep loss. You're going through your own quest to make sense of adoption. Like there's a lot there. What's your take on our tendency to forget that everyone's human in this?
Great question, man. Because I relate with you. I think there are stories that need to be told, there are truths that need to be exposed. And there's ways that we probably all have on a spectrum our comfortability to the tone, the spirit, the how. What's tricky is I think so much of the collateral damage that comes out where people are trying to figure out motivation and intention and who was complicit, who did. If the person who actually committed the offense stands up and says, a lot would have been prevented. But unfortunately, the natural tendency is for the person in power and the people around them is to preserve, which only feeds the advocates of the victims or the truth seekers or the wounded resistors to be like, I smell smoke. And where there's smoke, there's got to be a fire. And what? And I just think I wished in situations if people just went first and said, here's what happened. And when you don't do that and you manage, which is a human experience, to try and minimize, to manage, to cover up, to preserve, it just falls on more people to have to then bear that pain and attack and collateral damage. And that's hard. And from the outside, I understand it. Doesn't mean I like it. It just is.
Yeah. One of the stories I loved from your book, Steve, is you went to a Camino in Spain and you got completely lost. Like you went with a group, but you ended up on the wrong path. You needed help from a local. Just tell us about that and tell us about what you learned about getting lost.
Yeah. Well, the Camino de Santiago is this amazing trail and trek and pilgrimage where it follows the way of St. James, who brought the gospel to Spain. And so hundreds of thousands of people do it. And I think pilgrimage is a lost art in our culture in the US. And so I didn't really know what I was signing up for, but every day you would just kind of get your backpack on and walk a few miles, sit at a little cafe. And all you were doing is literally following these yellow arrows. I have like a bracelet, these yellow arrows and shells. And that's how you knew you were on the right path. So it was great. Cell phone reception was terrible, but you had the yellow arrow. And I'm just walking one day. And some days you just get lost in just the melodic of right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot. You're processing. And it's amazing just how walking stuff just comes up. And I missed a turn. Okay, and I found myself like on a highway overpass. And a lady stops and she could tell. She's like, "Are you looking for the Camino?" I'm like, "Yeah." And she tells me how to do it. And at the end of that night, every night we would get together with the group because we'd all walk sometimes together, sometimes separate. You Camino the way that you need to Camino for the day. And I remember sharing this story, and my buddy John Huckins just said something that really stuck with me because I was saying how much I hate being lost. And it felt like it was like describing my time in the desert. I just feel lost. And he just said, "Well, if you never get lost, you can never be found." And all of a sudden it like dawned on me, like, why am I preventing myself from being found? Why do I work so hard to preserve and not feel lost? And I'm actually working against the heart of the Father and the way, or the buen camino, the good way of Christ, who wants to remind me that it's okay to get lost because you can be found.
In my work, one of my favorite tools is called a verbatim, and not many people know about it. You write an essay of a leadership encounter that didn't go well. You present it to a group of peers. One of me or one of my people are facilitating. One of the things I love about it, Steve, is oftentimes I'll put peer groups together that have never done this before, and then they immediately become the body of Christ for each other. And it's like, it feels like I'm on holy ground. And I'll never forget this pastor was under all this pressure, this internal pressure of what kind of pastor he should be, this external pressure, his dad, uncle, grandfather, all pastors, the person he succeeded, he's got them all on his shoulders, trying to be a bit of all of them. And the theme of his essay and verbatim was, I'm drowning, I'm drowning. And me as the experienced facilitator and all his peers, we're all trying to save him. And one guy just looks at him and says, why don't you just go ahead and die? If you're drowning, why are we so anxiously trying to save you? Just drown. And let's put to death Pastor 1.0, because God's a God of resurrection. I was like, oh my goodness, this is
Yes.
amazing.
Yes.
What's your reaction to that? I love that story.
Oh, I think it's so beautiful. I know that some listeners might be hearing that being like, "Oh my gosh, it's so scary." But metaphorically, but spiritually, you sit there and you go, "Gosh, that's at the heart of Friday, Saturday, Sunday." Like
Yeah.
you don't get resurrection if something's still alive. And I feel like we constantly trying to hold to tradition or preserve. And it's like, what's the new thing that God is stirring and that the Spirit
Yeah.
has for us today? What's the new song, the new chapter, the next iteration that Christ wants to do in us and through us and for us and with us?
Yeah. In your book, I have not read a nonfiction in a long time that makes me cheer for the author so much as reading your book. Like, I mean, it helps that I know you, I think, but if I didn't, I'd be like, I hope this guy makes it. Like, it really, just the pile-on of loss upon loss upon loss in that period. You do link forgiveness and grief, and I thought that was fascinating. Tell us your understanding of the relationship between forgiveness and grief.
Yeah. I mean, when I started to think about these words, grieve, breathe, receive, they actually came to me the day after I resigned. I got up super early in the morning, went for a walk, and I probably a handful of times I felt like God has like impressed some words, and this was one of them. And I went to a donut shop in Madison, Wisconsin, and I just started journaling, and I just wrote, grieve what is, grieve what I thought it was going to be, and grieve how key people let me down. And the hardest too for me wasn't grieve what is. I mean, it's like, yeah, but grieve what I thought it was going to be. And the more I sat with that, the more it was like seeds that started to turn into anger fantasies. They turned into frustration. Like I had some versions of myself that I'm not proud of. But then once you start to look at it and you go, gosh, my definition for grief is just honor what comes up when change shows up. And I didn't know how to honor it. I knew how to stuff or manage or push away or pretend that it didn't happen. But I have to honor, yeah, those people hurt me. So now what I'm going to do about that? And I realized the gift that God gave humanity in forgiveness is literally like right from the jump of scripture to not have that level of toxicity or shame or disintegration happening within the body, but you have a chance to release it. Anytime one of those names would come to mind and I could feel myself, I realized I have a choice. And I would say this little prayer: cross, release, send it away. If I didn't do that, that anger would turn into bitterness, would turn into resentment, would turn into anger, rage, frustration. But if I could start to let it go, I could begin to do the work so that if the people who ever hurt me started to do their work, maybe, just maybe, there might be a miracle or reconciliation could happen. But if I don't do my forgiveness work and they do their forgiveness work, reconciliation won't happen. And it takes more than one person for reconciliation, but forgiveness is a solo sport. And I had to learn that.
All right, Steve, you have stood on the stage of Willow Creek Church. You have interned under Rob Bell in his prime. You have walked the dusty roads of Guatemala with Jimmy Miato, the president of Compassion International, while Henry Cloud was lingering in the background. However, you have not yet successfully endured the being human gauntlet. So I think we all have people in our lives that just trigger us. They're just a behavior about them. What is a behavior in another person that's guaranteed to irritate or trigger you?
I would say one of the easiest ones is, I think, people who aren't courteous. It's a real frustration to me. Like when I think that people don't give the benefit of the doubt, or when people talk down to someone, that stuff just, I don't think we see the human's curiosity. It's just move along. That really bothers me.
Okay. If you'd be so kind as to fill in the blank on this one. What if I were as blank to myself as God is?
The first word that came to my mind was persistent. Just never give up on people.
I like that answer. I've asked that question so many times. You're the first one to say that. I really like that answer. The next thing, I think this is a real gift to listeners when a pastor's willing to share this. I've asked this of all kinds of people, but Steve, where do you experience a gap between what you believe about God versus what you experience from God?
So I would say that God is trustworthy. I think over the last few years, I've have this mathematical formula: safe plus consistent again and again, over and over on repeat, makes someone worthy of trust. Someone unsafe consistently, not worthy of trust. And someone safe, but quite inconsistent, not worthy of trust. And that God is safe, that God is consistent, and that God will receive my fullness and brokenness. It was probably like not until the desert that I actually believed that. It was more driven by performance than I could not have to bright side everything. I could bring everything to him.
Hmm. This next one feels a bit left field, but I'm really provoked by it. Tell us about either the first time you encountered a dead body or the first time you experienced a colossal loss in your life. What was that like?
The first time I experienced it, saw a dead body, was a senior in high school, freshman in college, somewhere like around that time. And the woman who had been our basketball scorekeeper and librarian, Mrs. Magali, had had a brain aneurysm. She was a little like ornery, but she liked me and I liked her, and she was safe. And she got rushed to the hospital, and they let me go see her, and I sat beside her and I prayed for her. And I drove back to the church, and I had told the church office, "Hey, I've been praying for Mrs. Magali." And they're like, "Oh, Steve, she died." I'm like, "No, she didn't. I just was with her." And they're like, "Oh, they were just keeping her alive so she could donate her organs." The cognitive dissonance in that moment was wild because she was breathing, but she wasn't alive. That messed me up for a bit.
Yeah. All right. The last two questions are more on the proactive side. I'm fascinated by environments where people feel so at home that they can be exactly themselves. There's no pretense. There's no need to perform. Where have you felt home in the last month or so? Where has been a time or a person?
Hmm. So my wife and I just celebrated 20 years. And I think when you go through something, You're constantly wondering, like, can we trust each other? Can we be safe and consistent? As much as the work that we had to do to process through Willow, we also had to do like in some holes in our marriage. And a lot of it came out of my ambition. And so to have this space to get to 20, really, really meaningful. And she's home for me for sure.
All right, last question. What's a habit or practice or a person that helps you relax into the presence of God?
For a while I was doing the welcoming prayer from Mary Mordrowski and Father Thomas Keating in the mornings. That was really, really helpful. I think anytime that I can just get up and walk, something unlocks in me, in my prayer time, in just my soul. And then IFS has been really, really huge in my life, is being aware of the parts of me that feel powerless is usually when I'm most disintegrated, but learning to speak for and not speak from my parts has been really important to my own integration and health.
Mm. Friends, my guest is Steve Carter. His book, The Thing Beneath the Thing, came out a few years ago. Still one of the best and most helpful ways to access what's going on under the surface in your life. But his latest book just came out, Grieve, Breathe, Receive. The Friday, Saturday, Sunday of our faith. Loss, forgiveness, pain, but also joy and healing and freedom. It's a remarkable work. Steve, man, as always, thanks for coming on Being Human.
Thank you, man. Much love.
Being Human is a production of Christianity Today. It's executive produced by Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper. It's produced and edited by Matt Stevens. The associate producers are Mackenzie Hill and Ray Gilliam, with music by Dan Phelps, mix engineer Kevin Morris, and graphic design by Amy Jones.